What's Romeo and Juliet really about, according to Pantaloon? The image on your screen is of a building in Verona, Italy, which is marketed by the locals for considerable profit as being the House of Juliet. Adolescents from all over the world make the pilgrimage to Verona and stick on the house walls a snowstorm of letters that they write to Juliet. Of course, most of them haven't read the play, and of course Juliet is a purely fictional character, so it can't be her house. And of course, you can't deliver letters to someone who's supposed to have died many centuries ago. But kids still do, afloat on a cloud of fantasy. Some of them will have seen a Hollywood film loosely based on the play, and presumably they feel that it's all very romantic and very sad. But I think that a close look at Shakespeare's text produces far more complex reactions. What's Romeo and Juliet really about? Well, I think it's about romanticism. No, I didn't say it's romantic. I said it's about romanticism. In its narrowest sense, this refers to an idealized view of reality, and especially an idealized view of another person. But that, I think, comes from the propensity to categorize everything into uncompromising divisions of black and white, good and evil, love and hate. And then outright romantics commit themselves passionately to the most extreme examples of their simplified daydreams. Shakespeare usually creates memorable and unique characters, but both Romeo and Juliet are surprisingly unoriginal. They're not really delineated individually. Instead, they are mainly presented as stereotypes, examples of boundless romanticism and naive abandonment. From the start, Romeo conforms to the well-known type of the rejected lover. Montague describes his tears and sighs, and, like many a teenager, his hiding in the darkness of his room. Away from light steals home my heavy son, and private in his chamber pens himself, shuts up his windows, locks fair daylight out, and makes himself an artificial night. When he first enters, Romeo doesn't even reply to Benvolio's "Good morrow" with a similar greeting. Instead, he diverts the conversation to draw attention to his ostentatious misery. Is the day so young? Ay me, sad hours seem short. And by his exclamation, ay me, he conforms to Mercutio's later caricature of a lover's cliches. Cry but ay me, pronounce but love and dove. By being limited to such predictable behavior, Romeo seems almost comic. Also fitting the stereotype is his self-indulgent wordplay, which he uses to control the conversation in order to spend more time displaying his pose as the conventional tragic lover. In love? Asks Benvolio. Out, Romeo replies. Of love? Out of her favour, where I am in love. And he trots out a standard lover's list of oxymorons. Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health. Predictably, he expresses his devotion to Rosalind and rejection of all other girls by employing the usual religious metaphor. When the devout religion of mine eye maintains such falsehood, then turn tears to fire. Later he continues the conventional lover's use of religious terminology when he approaches Juliet. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. In response, Juliet uses the same standard metaphor. Saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. But what happened to Romeo's professed worship of Rosalind? He's using the same language of religious devotion, but it's already about a different girl. He said that his fidelity to Rosalind was the devout religion of mine eye. Yet his eye no sooner falls on Juliet than the sacred Rosalind is completely forgotten. Similarly, he had declared Rosalind rich in beauty, but he now says that Juliet has beauty too rich for use. Earlier, Benvolio guaranteed that he could show Romeo a girl more attractive than Rosalind. I will make thee think thy swan a crow. And now Romeo describes Juliet as a snowy dove trooping with crows. Since his new obsession with another complete stranger is expressed in identical terms, it's clear that he hasn't changed at all. He's only established his extreme fickleness and the unreliability of his stereotypical proclamations. The chorus emphasizes the sudden and extreme switch. Now old desire doth in his deathbed lie, and young affection gapes to be his heir. That fair, for which love groaned for and would die, with tender Juliet matched, is now not fair. And we are told that the new passionate pairing is only based on superficial physical attraction. Now Romeo is beloved, and loves again, alike bewitched by the charm of looks. The famous balcony scene is widely thought to be the height of passionate poetry, but it actually demonstrates the shallowness of his feelings. It is the East, and Juliet is the sun, is a cliché, and it's just an echo of his earlier tribute to Rosalind. The all-seeing sun ne'er saw her match since first the world begun. And he continues to talk in clichés. Juliet has eyes like stars, and is a bright angel, and a dear saint. It's now about a different girl, but it's the same language, expressing the same idealized daydream about a stranger. Since his fantasy about Rosalind has instantly evaporated, how long will his similar fantasy about the equally unknown Juliet last? But even he has reservations. I'm afeard, being in night, all this is but a dream. This, unfortunately, repeats Mercutio's earlier mockery of conventional dreams created by lovers' brains. You might expect Mercutio in this bravura set speech to dwell at length on something as important as the love of Romeo and Juliet, but he actually provides a long list of dreamers, among whom lovers are merely one brief example, without any great significance. Instead, he dismisses all dreams of every kind as the children of an idle brain, begot of nothing but vain fantasy, which is as thin of substance as the air, and more inconstant than the wind, who woos even now the frozen bosom of the north, and being angered, puffs away from thence, turning his face to the dew-dropping south. We can apply his words specifically to Romeo, who no longer woos the frozen bosom of Rosalind, and instead is turning his face to Juliet. He, like the wind, is inconstant, more inconstant than the wind, who woos even now the frozen bosom of the north, and being angered, puffs away from thence, turning his face to the dew-dropping south. And when, ludicrously, Romeo and Juliet, two complete strangers, announce that they want to get married immediately, it certainly does seem that they are enjoying a delightful but preposterous daydream. Romeo appears unaware that his own words reflect his juvenile behaviour. Love goes towards love, as schoolboys from their books, but love from love towards school with heavy looks. They seem like a couple of kids, so rushing into marriage confirms their volatility and impetuosity. Their immaturity is further implied by the friar. The earth that's nature's mother is her tomb. What is her burying grave? That is her womb. And from her womb children of divers kind we sucking on her natural bosom find. Then Shakespeare contrives that as Romeo enters, the friar continues, within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. Also, the image of Romeo as a schoolboy is repeated in the friar's words, thy love did read by rote that could not spell. We are reminded of Romeo's previous passion for Rosalind by her being named 6 times, and the friar voices the truism, young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. When Romeo offers the excuse, thou chidst me off for loving Rosalind, the friar corrects him, for doting, not for loving, pupil mine. And by calling him pupil, the friar again reduces Romeo to the level of a schoolboy. Furthermore, the young man's feeble justification, and badst me bury love, is rejected by the ghastly and ominous accusation, not in a grave, to lay one in, another out to have. Romeo's explanation for switching his obsession from Rosalind to Juliet is, her I love now doth grace for grace, and love for love allow. The other did not so. So he's saying that Rosalind was unresponsive, but Juliet is happy to play his game. That is supposed to be justification for hurtling into marriage, and of course into the marriage bed. I stand on sudden haste. I stand includes the innuendo, I have an erection. The friar criticizes the lovers' rash hurry. They stumble that run fast. But the boy is bursting with teenage hormones and isn't listening to a word. So Romeo rushes into marriage, and as soon as that is accomplished, rushes off and plunges into further emotional excess by killing Tybalt. There is supposedly the excuse that Tybalt killed Mercutio, but is that any justification for murder? especially since Romeo is potentially ending his marriage to Juliet before it has even been consummated. He actually makes a clear decision to commit violence. Away to heaven, respective lenity, and fire-eyed fury be my conduct now. He is as thoughtless in his passion for revenge as he was in his passion for romance and sex. His conduct in the subsequent scene at Friar Lawrence's cell is embarrassing. The friar has to drag him out of ignominious hiding to give him the good news that instead of the death penalty, his punishment has been reduced to banishment. However, Romeo doesn't express relief. On the contrary, he declares inaccurately, "Exile is death," and abandons himself to an orgy of melodramatic rant, shouting the word banishment 14 times. Then he becomes downright ridiculous when he expresses envy of creatures that will remain and so be able to see Juliet. Every cat and dog and little mouse, and grotesquely, carrion flies. Is this romantic? Incredibly, he flings himself on the floor and refuses to get up, like a temperamental child having a tantrum. So the nurse has to scold him as she would an exasperating boy. "Stand up! Stand up! Stand and you be a man! For Juliet's sake!" It's extremely apparent that he isn't yet a man, and he's far too immature to have embarked on marriage. And his own words reflect his juvenile behaviour. "I have stained the childhood of our joy with blood." Piling excess on excess, he even draws a dagger to kill himself, and thereby abandons any sense of responsibility to his new wife. So the friar has to say, "Wilt thou slay thyself, and slay thy lady?" And Romeo's lack of manhood is shown when the nurse, a woman, disarms him, again taking in hand the intemperate child. Since the boy is only capable of noisy self-pity, the grown-up friar has to form a plan and take care of practicalities. Only much later, when in Mantua he receives news of Juliet's presumed death, does Romeo seem capable of making decisions. "Get me ink and paper, and hire post-horses. I will hence tonight." But amazingly, there is little reaction to Juliet's death. I would expect stunned shock and crushing pain, and probably an emotional tribute to his wife. But all we get is it e'en so? Then I defy you, stars." Instead of focusing on Juliet, what he gives his energies to is describing at length the poverty of the apothecary, a complete stranger. And this is because Romeo is only interested in planning his own suicide, leaving Balthazar, like the friar earlier, to urge patience fruitlessly. But of course the boy's habitual impatience is such that even the drug's effect must be rapid. "The trunk may be discharged of breath as violently as hasty powder fired doth hurry from the fatal cannon's womb." Since we've previously seen Romeo trying to stab himself to death without a thought for Juliet, his present resort to poison seems again to be the hysterical excess of the self-absorbed adolescent. We might hope that Romeo's experiences would have made him calm down and grow up. And we might have hoped for a final scene that is sombre and dignified. But when he arrives at the Capulet's vault, the young man is just as hot-headed and uncivilized as ever. He warns Balthazar in melodramatic barbarity, "I will tear thee joint by joint, and strew this hungry churchyard with thy limbs. The time and my intents are savage, wild, more fierce and more inexorable far than empty tigers." Then, appallingly, the hushed and holy atmosphere of the churchyard is shattered by the sight and sounds of crude violence as Romeo smashes his way into the vault with a crowbar. But, incredibly, his behaviour gets even worse. Having earlier killed Tybalt, shouting his war cry, "Fire-eyed fury be my conduct," he now draws his sword again and kills Paris, blaming him for urging me to fury. And thus the final romantic tableau of the two lovers united in death is spoiled by the presence of a third body, which, astonishingly, Romeo drags over to lie next to Juliet. And its being steeped in blood is a continuing reminder of Romeo's ready propensity to violence. He typically puts the blame on sour misfortune and inauspicious stars. These kids never accept responsibility for their actions. Instead, he indulges in a long, meandering speech, which wanders from Juliet to Paris to Juliet to death as another person, back to Paris, to Juliet, to death as a person, to Juliet, to death, to Tybalt. So there's a fourth body in the tomb, intruding on the romantic pairing. Then back to Juliet, then death as a rival, and death again, and finally, my love, which might refer to Juliet, or maybe my love just refers to Romeo's feelings. But it isn't the final note. Romeo actually ends by addressing the apothecary again. "Oh, true apothecary!" Of course, the speech is full of cliches and climaxes with the greatest cliche of all. "Thus with a kiss I die." Since the stage is cluttered with the bloody corpse of Paris, as well as Tybalt and Juliet, I have to admit I find myself amending Romeo's words from "thus with a kiss I die" to "thus with another murder I die." Oh gosh. I really don't wish to stamp on people's romantic fantasies. I'm only too happy to let them enjoy their daydreams. It's just that I'm interested in examining what Shakespeare actually wrote, rather than what people wish he'd written. He'd had his own rash adolescence. He also married when he was a teenager. But by the time he wrote this play, he was living in London, while his wife was left with the children back in Stratford. And in these circumstances, the mature writer portrays every situation from all angles. So he creates the pair of lovers who become icons to those who are devoted to romance, but he includes in the text many honest insights for those who prefer reality. Anyway, I'll have a look at Juliet now. But first, a few bars of music. Very nice. And now, what about Juliet? Is she another example of uncontrolled romanticism? Chasing her daydreams headlong into death? Well, at her first appearance, she's almost silent, and, like a good little girl, properly subservient to her mother. "Madam, I am here. What is your will?" The main thing that we learn about her is her age. "She's not 14, says Lady Capulet. "She's not 14, echoes the nurse. "Come Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. And again, "On Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. The story from which Shakespeare adapted his play featured a heroine who was 16, but he has reduced her age to not 14, which means that Juliet is only 13. Her father had previously rejected Paris as a suitor by stressing her tender age. "My child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Shakespeare emphasizes that Juliet is little more than a child. So, juvenile naivety may be the reason, if not the excuse, for her behavior when at the party a complete stranger, wearing a mask, walks up and touches her hand, and she, shockingly, is compliant. Instead of withdrawing from this physical intimacy and calling for help, she immediately joins him in the game of creating between them a standard sonnet. It is, of course, very derivative, stuffed with the usual misapplied religious terms: holy shrine, pilgrim, saint, prayer. But after a mere 60 seconds, literally 60 seconds, of these second-hand sentiments, Romeo shows that his interests are far from religious purity. Outrageously, he kisses her, and, astonishingly, she allows him to kiss her again. They are then separated, but after a meeting lasting only 1 minute, she decides that the stranger is my only love. Well, she's only 13 years old. Unfortunately, her first words in the balcony scene are, "Ay me," the hackneyed lover's exclamation which Romeo has already used and which Mercutio has just burlesqued. So she's also talking like a stereotype. Shakespeare does give her one moment of cleverness. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But emotionally, she's quite out of control, offering herself recklessly and improperly to the stranger in the dark. "Take all myself." She does recognize that her extreme forward behavior may make her seem promiscuous. "If thou think I am too quickly won," and "thou mayst think my behaviour light," and "pardon me, and not impute this yielding to light love." But she has no intention of restraining herself. She's enjoying a great rush of euphoria, or as we say nowadays, she's high on the brain chemical dopamine. She does show some awareness of the danger of her commitment. "Thou mayst prove false," and "Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon, lest that thy love prove likewise variable." Furthermore, she does realize that she's being heedless and precipitate. "I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden." However, nothing can prevent her embracing her young girl's cliched fantasies. She describes Romeo as the god of my idolatry. And then, preposterously, the 13-year-old practically proposes to the figure hidden in the darkness. If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow. There is surprisingly a rather worrying note when she pictures herself as a falconer controlling a hawk. Oh, for a falconer's voice to lure this tassel gentle back again! And she furthers her wish to control Romeo by comparing him to a wanton's bird who lets it hop a little from her hand like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves, and with a silk thread plucks it back again. This is only their second brief meeting, but already she is wanting dominance in the relationship. And then she even admits, I should kill thee with much cherishing, which seems like a prediction of their death, caused by their own desires. The next time we see her, she's waiting for a message from Romeo, and is typically ungoverned in her impatience. In fact, she's also, it seems to me, so extremely childish that I picture her stamping her foot. The clock struck 9 when I did send the nurse. In half an hour she promised to return. Perchance she cannot meet him. That's not so. Oh, she's lame! In her total self-absorption, she's completely unsympathetic towards other people's problems. Old folks, many feign as they were dead. Unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. She's only concerned with her own instant gratification. When she sweet-talks the nurse to give her good news, she seems even more like a child in her behaviour and in her expression. Oh, honey nurse, good sweet nurse, good nurse, sweet, sweet, sweet nurse. Since she acts like a caricature of a little girl, it seems almost immoral that she receives news of her immediate marriage. However, in most stage productions of the play, the actors have been considerably older and less volatile, so audiences see characters who are more grown up, even if that isn't consistent with the text. Shakespeare emphasizes the feeling of the youngster's crazy pace by taking from his source a plot which lasts about 9 months and compressing it into 4 days. This makes the lovers seem wildly manic and foolhardy. So Juliet ends the scene with the nurse and then rushes back on stage for her marriage literally only 1 minute later. Friar Lawrence offers another warning about their impetuous haste. Too swift arrives as tardy as too slow. And when Juliet dashes in, he observes that she has so light a foot, so light is vanity. He further warns, these violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, which specifies that their violent ends are caused not by the stars, but by their indulgence in violent delights, in romance, in sex, and in fighting. Furthermore, he says that the delights die like fire and powder, which as they kiss, consume. But having warned that fire and powder produce death when they kiss, he allows Romeo to kiss Juliet and her to kiss him back. The two kids can't even wait until after the ceremony to get their hands on each other. This, of course, recalls their abandon at their first meeting when they immediately kissed. So they are completely deaf to the friar, who is the voice of staid religious teaching, and is one of the old folks whom Juliet criticized, and is also a man with a vow of chastity, which is the last thing the two teenagers are thinking about. When we next see Juliet, she's in another fit of impatience, anticipating sex with her new husband. "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging." The language is more sophisticated, I would actually say melodramatic. More sophisticated than in the previous scene, when she was waiting for the nurse and complained, "From 9 to 12 is 3 long hours, yet she's not come." But in the present scene, she still behaves like an impatient child, and even defines herself as such. "So tedious is this day, as is the night before some festival, to an impatient child that has new robes and may not wear them." And the child asks for instruction, as from a grown-up, on how to lose her virginity. "Come, civil knight, thou sober-suited matron, all in black, and learn me how to lose a winning match." When she is told that Romeo has killed Tybalt, she again displays her immature volatility. She doesn't ask for details, she just plunges into an emotional attack on her new husband. "O serpent heart, hid with a flowering face, did ever dragon keep so fair a cave?" Her ignorance of his true character is shown by the way she immediately changes from worshipping him as the god of my idolatry to condemning him as a serpent. Her perception of the world is limited to the crudest opposites, as listed in her oxymorons. "Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical, dove-feathered raven, wolfish ravening lamb." This is similar to Romeo's use of oxymoron in Act 1. "Feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health," which revealed him as derivative in his words, and therefore imitative in his feelings. And by including dove-feathered raven, Juliet is descending to clichés, similar to Benvolio's earlier "I will make thee think thy swan a crow," and Romeo's "a snowy dove trooping with crows." Both lovers have a juvenile view of human beings, based on the simplest stereotypes. So, of course, when the nurse dares to agree with her, "Shame come to Romeo!" Juliet hurtles to the opposite emotional position. "Blistered be thy tongue for such a wish!" And she continues to indulge her feelings extravagantly by hammering away at the same words, echoing Romeo by shouting "Banished" 5 times, and crying "dead" or "death" 9 times. Like Romeo also, her next melodramatic and selfish thought is of suicide. "Death, not Romeo, take my maiden head." And like Romeo, she leaves it to the grown-ups to eschew hysteria and to come up with a practical proposal. The nurse has to act. "I'll find Romeo to comfort you." So the child bride is able to retreat again into cosy romantic clichés. "Give this ring to my true knight." Inevitably, the two teenagers calm down after a night of sex, But she still shows her self-centeredness when Romeo says, "I must be gone and live, or stay and die." She's so childishly willful that she tries to convince him that day isn't breaking because she doesn't want it to, and so she puts his life in danger. "Stay yet, thou needs not to be gone." But when he gives in to her, "Come, death, and welcome," Juliet wills it so. She, as usual, flies to the opposite extreme, and her language is, as often, juvenile. It is! Hie hence! Begone! Away!" However, she does manage more restrained behaviour when she uses ambiguous language to her mother, giving the impression that she wants to inflict violence on Romeo, when in fact she wishes to enjoy more sex with him. She says he is "from the reach of these hands," that "I never shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him," and that she wants to wreak the love I bore my cousin upon his body. Sadly, when her father insists that she marry Paris, she reverts to the usual crude threats of suicide. "If all else fail, myself have power to die." This continues when again she seeks help from an adult, the friar. "Do thou but call my resolution wise, and with this knife I'll help it presently." And putting the onus on him, she announces, "I long to die, if what thou speak'st speak not of remedy." It's emotional and moral blackmail. Solve my problems for me, or I'll kill myself. And again, the 13-year-old indulges in melodramatic posturing. "Oh, bid me leap, rather than marry Paris, from off the battlements of any tower." Then she takes the opportunity to relish, at considerable length, Gothic horrors. "Or hide me nightly in a charnel house, or covered quite with dead men's rattling bones. Or bid me go into a new-made grave, and hide me with a dead man in his shroud." Teenagers love that sort of stuff. But as you get older, you feel that approaching death isn't quite so exciting. Then, before she takes the sleeping draught, she plunges into a further orgy of Gothic fantasies. "Oh, if I wake, shall I not be distraught, environed with all these hideous fears, and madly play with my forefather's joints, and pluck the mangled Tybalt from his shroud, and in this rage, with some great kinsman's bone, as with a club, dash out my desperate brains?" Teenagers love that stuff. It's another function of their feverish imaginations, like their launch into extravagant romanticism. Her subsequent waking in the tomb and immediate suicide are covered surprisingly briefly, and are very routine. She kisses Romeo and stabs herself. But there's no poetry. Shakespeare allows her to go through the standard actions without originality, subtlety, or tenderness. It's perfunctory, melodramatic, and shallow. Quite deliberately, the author doesn't give this the depth of tragedy. Sorry, but it's just melodrama. Shakespeare has created two characters who are the embodiment of romanticism, but there's not much more to them. They're not really individuals. They are very immature, and much of their language and behaviour is derived from traditional stereotypes. So, is there anything else influencing their actions? Yes, of course. They are teenagers, so they are driven partly by the urgency of sexual desire. We're constantly made aware that bubbling beneath their romantic clichés is lust at its most insistent. Mercutio is blunt about the realities of sexual urges. He explicitly describes Rosalind's quivering thigh and the demesne that there adjacent lie. And he says that Romeo could raise a spirit in his mistress' circle of some strange nature, letting it there stand till she had laid it and conjured it down. He becomes even cruder. Oh, that she were an open arse, thou a popper in pear. And Shakespeare places this adolescent male's sexual innuendos directly before the balcony scene, when Juliet enters with the cliched exclamation, "Ay me," and Romeo addresses her as the conventional bright angel. Mercutio's vulgarities at least have originality and vigour. By comparison, the lovers seem limp and commonplace. Similarly, the nurse regularly reminds us of the reality of our libidos, even joking about Juliet's inevitable sexual activity. "Thou wilt fall backward when thou comest to age, wilt thou not, Jule?" It stinted and said, "Aye." And her later words about the prostrate, blubbering Romeo are unconscious innuendos. "Oh, he's even in my mistress' case," means either he's in the same emotional state as Juliet, or it means he's inside Juliet's vagina, her case. Then the nurses demand, "For her sake, rise and stand," means either get up off the floor, or it means, for her benefit, get an erection, stand. Then, "Why should you fall into so deep an hole?" means either, "Why are you groaning so despairingly?" or it means, "Why should you enter Juliet's vagina, her O?" Shakespeare refuses to offer us just vacuous romanticism. Also, when the nurse was carrying messages between the lovers, Mercutio accused her of being aboard, aboard, aboard! And the suggestion that she's acting as a paid go-between is strengthened when Romeo actually gives her money. The burgeoning romance is characterized as a mere sexual transaction. And even the friar, amazingly, seems to encourage foreplay when he urges Romeo to kiss Juliet before their wedding. "Romeo shall thank thee, daughter, for us both." Inevitably, during the balcony scene, which some people like to think is purified of gross physicality, Romeo cries, "Oh, wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied?" The sexual implication is clear. Then Juliet, awaiting her wedding night, cries, "Come night, come Romeo, come thou day and night." And as well as meaning approach, come also meant then as now have an orgasm. She repeats, "Come, gentle knight, come, loving black-browed knight," and then looks forward to "when I shall die," when die is also ambiguous, since it can refer to the collapse after orgasm. We are regularly reminded that a major force driving the couple's actions is not fate or inauspicious stars, but simple adolescent sexual desire. The rising level of teenage testosterone provokes not only lust, but also a wish for violence. The play begins with a combination of both. In Samson's ugly boast, "When I have fought with the men, I will be cruel with the maids. I will cut off their heads, or their maiden heads. He would like to demonstrate his virility by committing murder and then rape. It's a savage image, using his sword to cut off their maidenheads. And Romeo is part of this world of adolescent violence. He takes young Juliet's maidenhead with her eager consent and kills both Tybalt and Paris. Even the older generation, ridiculously, still attempt this youthful macho posturing. In the first scene, Capulet, undignified in his nightgown, calls for his sword, but his wife suggests that, at his age, a crutch would be more appropriate. While Montague is prevented from proving his manhood by being overpowered by a woman, his wife. "Hold me not! Let me go!" Benvolio, out on the streets with Mercutio, warns, "Now these hot days is the mad blood stirring," words which are immediately followed by the violent deaths of Mercutio and then Tybalt. However, the mad blood can not only refer to male explosions into violence, but also to the whole of Romeo and Juliet's wild and hectic affair. The explosion of their passion is fueled by mad blood. The culture of these people is based on simple divisions and warring opposites. The world is viewed in literally black and white terms. Light versus darkness, day versus night, doves versus ravens, life versus death. And so it continues. Love versus hate, the Capulets versus the Montagues, angels versus devils, the young versus the old, and sweets versus poison. If you examine the text, you'll find that it's absolutely crammed with all these pairs of opposites. Romeo and Juliet exemplify the attitudes and behavior of all the members of that society, and this feeds their idealized view of each other. A rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, a snowy dove trooping with crows, my only love sprung from my only hate. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. Fiend angelical, a damned saint, and so on and so on. There is no middle ground, no possibility of negotiation, and no realization that a human being cannot simply be the personification of any of these extremes. Instead, we are all a mixture of good and bad. But of course, a realistic perception of a person's faults, as well as their strengths, would immediately extinguish the romantic daydream. And that is why separation is a standard element in a romance. The basic plot of most romantic stories is that the lovers have to struggle against forces which keep them apart. So the beleaguered pair can devote their energies to combating their common enemy instead of spending the time really getting to know one another, which would dissipate their fantasy. If the warring Montagues and Capulets joyfully accepted the marriage of their offspring, there wouldn't be much of a plot or much of a romance. In fact, several readers have suggested that if Romeo and Juliet had enjoyed a nice family wedding without opposition, the marriage probably wouldn't have lasted long. They think that Romeo would soon object to being constricted by a wife who tried to keep him like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves. And having previously discovered that he could completely change his mind about Rosalind, He would now find that Juliet also wasn't the girl of his dreams, his lovely, unrealistic dreams. I'm afraid to say that some of this play could be performed as a comedy. When Juliet's parents and the nurse discover her drugged body, they exclaim in notably unpoetic terms, "She's dead! Deceased! She's dead! Alack the day! Alack the day! She's dead! She's dead! She's dead!" And meanwhile, as in a comedy, the audience know that she isn't dead. The nurse's repetitions, "Oh day, oh day, oh day, oh hateful day," even recall the comic version of Two Lovers' Death, which appears in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the hero stabs himself with the words, "Now die, 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 die." The exclamation, "Oh!" which the nurse repeats, appears with astonishing regularity throughout the play. For example, Romeo in the balcony scene exclaims, "Oh, it is my love! Oh, that she knew she were!" And, "Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand!" And, "Oh, speak again, bright angel!" Similarly, after Romeo kills Tybalt, Lady Capulet exclaims, "Oh, my brother's child! Oh, prince! Oh, cousin! Oh, the blood is spilled of my dear kinsman! Oh, cousin, cousin!" The author's deliberate effect is to make the exclamation sound routine, and so diminish the impact. The characters seem given to hysteria and ostentatious emotional display, so we don't take them that seriously. The scene in which reactions to Juliet's supposed death are expressed is a real challenge to actors and directors. How can they perform it without getting a laugh? The highly stylized exclamations of Paris, "Beguiled, divorced, wronged, spited, slain," are echoed by Capulet, "Despised, distressed, hated, martyred, killed." And similarly, the nurse's shouts, "A woeful day! A woeful day!" are continued by Paris, "O love! O life!" and by Capulet, "O child! O child!" This makes me think that Shakespeare is deliberately emphasizing the absurdity in the way these characters self-centeredly indulge their passions, just as Romeo and Juliet indulge theirs, and are concerned with only their own feelings. Again, the tone is noisily melodramatic. It is not tragic. But that doesn't mean that the author is being satirical. He isn't mocking his characters. He just brings them to life by words and actions, and then offers, as ever, other viewpoints, so that we can see the whole picture in perspective. An example of this complete change of focus is when he sends onto stage a group of musicians hired to play at Juliet's wedding to Paris. Their reaction to her theoretically tragic death is only to wonder whether they will still get paid. Musicians sound for silver. Their insensitivity and selfishness is really no more than those of the main characters. Romeo and Juliet are obsessed by their own feelings. Capulet and the others are only concerned about their reactions to the apparent death. And the musicians have their own priorities to consider, earning a living. Furthermore, the script here again includes unconscious sexual innuendo. Some readers dismiss this as just bawdy jokes to create comic relief, but Shakespeare's more sophisticated than that. Earlier, the nurse used the word case, which could be a term for the vagina. And here it is again. This is a pitiful case. The case may be amended. And so, put up our pipes, put up, can mean insert our penises. But it's not just so-called bawdy. It's another reminder that much of this extreme and almost farcical situation is caused not by the stars, but by the simple human sexual impulse. And so we begin the dash through Act 5, which briskly gets through 3 more deaths. And then the friar offers to explain, "I will be brief," promising to avoid a tedious tale. And then he holds up the action with a tedious tale, unnecessarily summarizing the whole plot of the play. It's much longer than Juliet's perfunctory death. It seems that even he is given to thoughtless self-indulgence. Eventually, we reach the end of the performance, and perhaps the limpest couplet that Shakespeare ever wrote. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. It's quite deliberately feeble and glib. Inevitably, the desperate romantics will still be easily satisfied by this jingle, while the more thoughtful theatre-goers will almost smile at the shallow sentimentality that is typical of romanticism. Shakespeare has created an enormously successful play suited to popular tastes, whilst also including psychological insights and adult perspectives. Finally, I must admit that when I began this analysis, I was slightly worried that I would seem to be no more than a spoilsport, apparently trying to crush other people's romantic fantasies, and even seeming to be another example of the old versus the young. But of course, people who love romanticism would never be hindered by someone pointing out that the myth of Romeo and Juliet that they treasure is absolutely not supported by a close reading of Shakespeare's play. They would simply ignore such ugly truths, just as the teenage pair ignore the friar's realistic warnings. These violent delights have violent ends. Romance is always a lovely drug, even being boosted by the final deaths, which are called romantic. As the picture on your screen shows, adolescents will always flock to cover the walls of some house, even if it's just a tourist trap, with their love letters, written to someone, appropriately, who never existed.